Hello everyone, my name is Becky Durst and I will be your moderator for tonight. This evening we will start our plant clinic with our bug watch. Then we'll hear from Sylvia, who will be talking about pollination and why pollinators are important for your garden. Caitlin will present information about pollinators you know and the pollinators you might not think about. And Heather will discuss what plants to grow to attract pollinators to your garden and why. Tonight, you'll get some fantastic information about how pollinators can increase your harvest, as well as how to add beautiful diversity to your garden by adding plants that attract pollinators. So I'm going to get us started tonight with our bug watch. And this week, we're featuring butterflies that you might be able to attract to your garden. So there's nothing prettier. I always look for the first butterfly of the season. There's nothing prettier than to find that butterfly flitting around in the flower garden. If you're like me, you often wonder what types you are seeing, or if you're afraid to squish the caterpillars you find eating your plants because you don't know who it's going to grow up to be. The first thing to note is that all butterflies have the same life cycle called a complete metamorphosis. So they all start as an egg and turn into a larva or caterpillar, and that's the feeding stage, which may have several stages of development unto itself. Then they form a pupa, the transition stage. The pupa is also called a chrysalis and is where the caterpillar seemingly magically changes from larva to butterfly. It can last anywhere from a few weeks to a month or even longer. Then the adult butterfly emerges, and the adult's main job is to mate and lay eggs. Now, most adult butterflies live only 1 or 2 weeks, but some species hibernate during the winter and may live several months. So butterflies have a long tongue called a proboscis, which they can curl and uncurl to drink through like a straw to drink sweet nectar from flowers. And while nectar is a staple in the butterfly's diet, there are some nutritional aspects missing from nectar. So salt and other minerals can be obtained from standing water. So that's why you often see the butterflies on puddles or on the sandy shores of streams or creeks. They also love rotting fruit because they can actually get all of their nutrients at once from rotting fruit. So while the adult butterflies enjoy the buffet of our entire garden, the larvae require a host plant. And that's the plant specific to the species of butterfly that the adults will lay their eggs on and the larvae will feed on. So while having a great nectar and water source is key to drawing butterflies into your garden, having the host plants there is key to getting them to stay in your garden. So some examples of host plants are milkweed, violets, goldenrod, native trees, and with especially oaks leading the way, hosting over 500 species of butterflies. So as we go through, here's just some common butterflies you may see in your garden. So we have the eastern tiger swallowtail and its larva, and then the black tiger swallowtail. There's a lot of different types of swallowtails we can see, but these are the two I've seen most commonly in my garden. And I actually have about 18 black swallowtail caterpillars right now on my fennel that we're trying to keep the birds off of to let them go to turn into butterflies. And then we have everybody's favorite, the monarch. I find that monarchs come to my garden late. We always think that we missed them. And then suddenly in August or the beginning of September, we're seeing lots of caterpillars and we're seeing lots of chrysalises. And then the viceroy is the false monarch. So you can look at the two pictures and see how they are slightly different. And they have different host plants. So the monarch is the one that you need the milkweed to draw the monarch in. And then we have everybody's favorite, the cabbage white, which is such a beautiful little butterfly. And then its caterpillars will decimate your brassicas. My kids go through and pick the caterpillars off and drop them in soapy water because those are ones I will not let turn back into adults. And then we have a painted lady, which is really, really pretty. And I often see that on my echinacea. The buckeye. I don't see a lot of those in my garden, but they are common to the area. The spotted skipper, which I see the adults all the time, but I've actually never seen the caterpillar. And now I'm going to be looking for it after seeing that picture. And then last but not least, we have the painted lady. So if you're curious how to attract butterflies to your garden, there's a fantastic resource about host plants for native butterflies linked here, and I will put that in the chat box for you. So now we're going to move on to our first presentation of the night. Sylvia Liu is here to present about pollination and why pollinators are important for your garden. Sylvia, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so good evening, everyone. I'm going to be talking about pollination tonight. So what is pollination? Pollination is an essential part of plant reproduction. So how it happens is that you have pollen from one flower that rubs or drops onto a pollinator. Oftentimes we think of bees as a pollinator, but there are actually many, many different animals that could be pollinators. And then the pollinator will take this pollen to another flower, and then the pollen would essentially fertilize the female part of the flower. And because of that fertilization process, the plant will flower and the plant will later have fruit and make seeds. And that is essentially the entire process of pollination. And in the next slide, you can see a picture of how this happened. So the graphic on the left, you can see pollens from a flower. And then you see there's a bee that might have gone to that flower, and the pollen would have rubbed off on the bee's body. If you see the picture on the right, you can see this bee is covered in pollen. So you know this bee is doing a very good job pollinating, because when that bee goes to another flower, then the pollen will be deposited and the reproduction process would be complete. So why is pollination important? There are approximately 75% of all flowering plants that rely on animal pollinators. So there are other ways where the pollination could happen without animals, such as wind pollination. So just like what it sounds, if there's pollen, the wind can carry the pollen and carry the pollen to another plant. That would also make pollination happen. But as the slide shows, 75% of pollination actually relies on animal. So that means there are over 180,000 different plant species and more than 1,200 crops that relies on animal as pollinators. So without those pollination, many of the flowering plants will not produce fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So this is an interesting fact. Actually, 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we have would not be available without pollination. So 1 out of 3, that is a pretty substantial amount of food that relies on pollination. So some examples are fruits. You know, you have apples, oranges, and also vegetable, so tomatoes. Also coffee. Coffee relies on animal pollinators. And as well as like grapes and other fruits and vegetables. So this is the interesting graphic that really shows how important pollination is. So the picture on the right is breakfast that are available to us because of pollinators. So you see fruit juice, you see jam, you see nuts, and then the picture on the the picture on the left is the one that shows our breakfast with the help of pollinators. And the picture on the right is a picture that shows without pollinators, without pollination, how limited our food would be. You know, you will only have egg, bread, and you won't have the nuts or the fruit juice. So why is pollinators important in home gardens? So similar to what I talked about before. If you have a home garden, you are planting vegetables, you're planting fruits, and in order for your vegetable and your fruit to have to grow fruit and to grow seeds, your home garden will have to have pollinators. So these pollinators will include bees, flies, beetles, butterflies, moths, and ants. So pollinators are essential for homegrown vegetables and fruit crops. For example, in my garden, I planted garden peas, bush beans, cherry tomatoes, blueberries, blackberries, American hazelnuts, and pawpaw trees. And all those plants rely on pollinators. Also, pollinators also play an important role in herb gardens, especially if you want your plants to go to seeds that you can plant again. Without the pollinators pollinating the plants would not be going to seed. So here are some of the sources that I relied on to put the presentation together. They are fascinating read. So if you have time, take a look at them and you will be fascinated in how many, what an important role pollination is to not only the commercial crops that we have in society, but also our home garden.
That was fantastic. That one out of every 3 bites statistic is that's really remarkable. That really kind of drives it home. Okay. Our next presenter is Caitlin McKeegan, who has some fantastic information to share about the pollinators you know and the pollinators you may not think about. Caitlin, I will turn things over to you.
Thanks, Becky. I'm really excited about this presentation. I'm going to try and keep my slides brief, but know that I could talk about this all day. This is something that is near and dear to my heart. So I'm here to talk today about what pollinators are. You know, a lot of us know bees and butterflies and things like that, but you know, there are lots of pollinators that are out there that are important in our garden ecosystems. So when you think of pollinators, this is probably the image that comes to mind is a honeybee. And, you know, that is certainly a really important, honeybees are certainly really important to our agricultural industry. But what you may not know is that honeybees are not native to Virginia. They're not our main pollinators. And they're important for industrial crop production. And that's why you hear about, they'll actually ship bees from fields to field so that they pollinate each field. But those are not bees that are native to the United States. They're European honeybees. And in the industry, people consider these more of an agricultural commodity than really part of our ecosystem. So that was kind of surprising to me because as we're hearing about the colony collapse disorder and things like that, it's because these hives are in these very dense populations, and that's contributing to their some of the issues that we're seeing. And they're not actually the bees and other pollinators that we're used to seeing in their native climates. So Virginia is home to a whole bunch of native bees. And I love this graphic because it shows the wide range of bees. And I mean, you have everything from the big bumblebees down to these little teeny tiny sweat bees. You have leaf cutter bees. So if you see holes in some of the leaves in your garden, it won't hurt the plant. Those bees are using those leaf cutouts to lay their eggs and make their little nests. And these bees are some of the most efficient pollinators we have. They're responsible for pollinating wildflowers. Like Sylvia said, we wouldn't get seeds or fruit if these bees weren't active in our ecosystems. They're important for orchards and they also pollinate agricultural fields. So these bees are really important. And what you might not know is that these aren't bees that live in hives. A lot of these are solitary bees. They live on their own. And so if you start paying attention to what you're seeing in your garden, if you plant a few native plants for pollinators, which I know Heather's going to get to in just a minute, you might start to see the great variety of bees that we have in our area. And it's really cool to see, who you draw to your garden. So it's not just bees. There are, of course, butterflies that are important pollinators, but wasps, beetles, flies, hummingbirds, moths, the wind, bats, ants, like all of these insects can be a pollinator. And so, you know, my advice to all of you is to start looking at what's in your garden, paying attention to it, and just kind of seeing who's active, and not immediately when you see a bug or insect, you know, a pest in your garden, immediately assume that it's there to do harm. Sometimes, you know, they all live in the world. And so, you know, making space for these insects is really important. So ways that you can encourage pollinators in your garden is to limit, I say don't use, that's a, you know, a choice, but definitely limit the use of chemicals and pesticides as much as you can. And we're going to get to this in a minute, but making some space for native plants is one of the best ways that you can encourage these beneficial insects in your garden. And so if you plant a couple things, if you have a space for, you know, some perennial plantings near your vegetable garden, you're going to draw those pollinators towards your vegetable garden and encourage this ecosystem that has beneficial insects that not only pollinate your garden, but also can help control some pests. So a wasp, for example, is a predatory insect, but it's also a pollinator. So it might help control some of the pests you see in your garden. And then leaving some habitat for pollinators, leave some sticks, leave some bare earth if you can. This is, I put this in there because this is what I tell myself. I'm like, try not to be too tidy. It's okay if your garden isn't perfectly groomed at every moment. It sometimes leaves a little bit of space for extra life there. And this, I think, I'm trying to think what lecturer we heard this from. It was one that, you know, we were lucky to hear speak to us as master gardeners, but their advice was to watch and learn before you react. So if you see an insect on a plant, don't immediately run out for something to control it. You know, kind of notice what's happening. Is that insect actually hurting your plant, or is it there to eat something that might actually be hurting your plant, like an aphid or something that's really small? So, you know, just take some time to study the garden and rhythms and what you're seeing there before you take action. And then really quickly, you know, we've been talking in the plant clinics this year about a really comprehensive view of your garden from, you know, the dead of winter to, you know, the fall when you're picking the last things and putting your garden to bed. And pollinators are really active all year long. So in early spring, we talk about, you know, we all love Virginia bluebells. Those are early ephemerals that come up, and pollinators need those early plants to provide food after they're coming out of hibernation. They're migrating, they're tired, they're hungry. And so all of those early blooming things really give them a lot of nourishment that they really need. And then as we're getting to now, we're at peak summer. Everything is blooming. You're seeing a lot of activity in your garden. And these long days are really like, you know, peak pollinator activity. But even into the fall and winter, there's a lot of pollinator activity. In the fall, all those monarch butterflies that you love so much are migrating. And others that stay here are hibernating and getting ready to build up their reserves for winter. So I always, in my garden, I feel like the activity actually ramps up another level in the fall because everyone's, you know, really rushing to store everything for winter. And then, you know, like I said, even in the winter, pollinators are there. So, you know, the best advice is to kind of if you do have a native plant garden, give yourself some grace. Again, try not to be too tidy. Wait until that garden really starts to warm up. You've had a couple, you know, 70-degree days when the ground starts to get warm before you clean up your perennials that might be there. So that's my, you know, don't be too tidy. That's okay. The insects really love it. And then I just wanted to share a couple, like Sylvia said, this is a fascinating subject to read about. I hope that all of you are as excited about it as we are. But I think we both cited the same Smithsonian Gardens article. This was a really great overview, and they have a lot of really interesting graphics. So if you have kids that you're gardening with, that is a great resource where you can kind of see a lot of information there. And then, you know, at the state level, at the federal level, local wildlife conservancies, everybody's really working to conserve pollinators, and there's a wealth of information out there. So I encourage you all to read more at your leisure.
I had no idea that mosquitoes were pollinators, and I'm glad to know they do serve a purpose in this world, because before that I didn't really understand why we had them.
And actually, if mosquitoes vanish from the earth, our entire food web would collapse, which is a crazy thing. So as those mosquitoes are biting in the summer, they do serve a purpose.
I will remember that. I will still smack them. Our next presenter is Heather Felton, and she will be talking about what plants to grow to attract pollinators and why. So over to you, Heather.
All right, thank you. So I also am very excited about this topic. If you go to the next slide, I've made an effort to plant native Virginia plants around my house, and in the next slide you'll see it, especially in my garden. So I've got some echinacea. I've got some echinacea around the front of my house, and also some butterfly plants, not to be confused with butterfly bush. This is a native one, and it's a little early. I just took these pictures last weekend. Nothing's blooming yet, but they're really beautiful for people, and they're a great habitat for the pollinators. And in the next slide, I actually I turned over one of my raised beds in my garden to native Virginia pollinator support plants. And so you can see that on the right, I've got black-eyed Susans and goldenrod, echinacea, and bee balm, and then I sort of supplement the bare spots with annuals. And I've noticed a huge difference in my the output in my garden since I put these plants in, and they're also pretty. And my husband loves his turf grass, and so there wasn't a lot of space in the lawn, so I just turned a bed in the garden over to those. On the left side, we have a big stick pile behind the garden to provide habitat for whatever decides to live in there. It's one of the recommendations that I've heard, make some space for caterpillars and chrysalises and all kinds of native pollinators that don't live in hives, as in honeybees, like Caitlin said. So we just wanted to give them a little more space right next to the garden. And the next slide and the slides after that are some native plants that support pollinators that you might consider if you're looking for some native plants to support your pollinators. Also, I have some non-native plants that are, especially in the spring, are really attractive to the early bees and other pollinators. We've got a couple cherry trees, which clearly are not native to Virginia, but provide a really early spring source of nectar for the pollinators. Also have some peonies, again, not native to Virginia, but we're full of bees this spring. So that's just some ideas. Native plants, two that I've used in my garden are black-eyed Susans and bee balm. Since I put these in, I see just a variety of butterflies and bees. We get swallowtails in there and any number of different sized bees. The next slide is just a couple more natives. The New York ironweed and the field thistle also are pretty early bloomers in the spring and can get you that early, the early support for your pollinators. And the next slide, the eastern redbud is a tree we see a lot in this area, blooms pretty early, and that's a great source of nectar for your pollinators. And then the gay feather is also a good one. And the next slide is goldenrod and Joe Pyeweed. I'd never heard of Joe Pyeweed until I started the Master Gardener classes, and it's a favorite among the Master Gardeners and because it's so great for pollinators. And then goldenrod, which is great all into the fall. And yeah, that's it. If you want more information, plantvirginianatives.org is a great resource about Virginia native plants, kind of how, like a whole section on how to be friendly to your bees. It's just a really great resource, and I definitely recommend that if you're interested in more plants that you can plant in your garden or around your garden to attract pollinators. And at the Master Gardener booth, there's a native Virginia plant, a couple of books that we have with great pictures. So if you're looking for some ideas, you can come and take some pictures of those and get your pollinator friendly garden going.
Fantastic. Thank you, Heather.
Susan has asked what a good pollinator plant choice would be to put near your vegetable garden. Heather, I know you went through a couple, but what's your top choice?
The echinacea seems to be very popular. That's where I see a lot of butterflies. For bees, it's I think really any native plant, and if you get flowers of different designs, because some pollinators need kind of a deeper cup to get the nectar out of. Some are on the surface. So I think just a variety of plants is the best way to go.
And Becky, I would jump in to support that. Again, supporting pollinators is a year-long effort. And so, and we all are here because we love plants, right? So it's an opportunity to put a little bit more effort into planting your garden and have something blooming year round.
And definitely if you can get plants that kind of span from early spring into the fall, so you can, give a support to the pollinators all through the year, instead of just kind of, high summer when everything's blooming. If you can get into the spring and the fall, you can help those bees when they first come out, and some of them before they go hibernate.
Tony threw in the chat box, I've heard that it's useful to place various potted herbs, basil, dill, marjoram, etc., throughout the vegetable garden so as to further attract more pollinators to the party. Does anyone practice this? I definitely do. I don't know about you, the two of you. I have pots of herbs kind of all over the place because I'm a little bit obsessed. But I love the fact that, with your chives, you have the really early chive flowers. And then in your basil, you've got your high season flowers. And then the thyme kind of blooms all season long if you don't cut it back religiously. You'll get your oregano, your sage, like all of those have like different shape, different color flowers to attract different things that all happen at different times of the season. And I like planting that. And then I like to interplant some marigold, some borage, and some nasturtium in the garden bed itself. Just to kind of, they're all supposed to be good for pest control, attracting the bad bugs away from the good plants. I don't know, but like, I just love how it looks. And there's definitely a lot of activity in the garden I've never had to worry about. I see all these people talking about hand pollinating their squash plants, and I'm like, I've never had to worry about that. So
yeah, I don't have my herbs in pots, but I do have a spot in one of my raised beds where I have all the herbs. So you get sort of the same effect.
Yeah. Susan chimed in. She had Joe Pye weed, but decided it needed more and more space, so I had to find a new home. Yes, thank you, Susan. And I have some growing in the back right now too. I'm pretty excited for that. And again, I found out about Joe Pye weed from the Master Gardeners. Yes. Like it was not on my radar before. Question from Sylvia, do you plant bee balm in the ground? Does it spread aggressively?
It does spread aggressively. So I end up pulling about half of it out every fall, because it will take over the bed if you don't control it. But seems very popular for the bees. So, I don't want to get rid of it, but you definitely have to control it, because it will spread and take over everything. I found some growing outside of the bed where I planted it last spring. So yeah, you have to keep an eye on it.
Now, one of the things I've seen too, though, is just with the butterfly weed and the milkweed and the host plants for like the butterflies, the goldenrod, is how many pollinators they do actually attract. And so like how many more things they serve than just, so many people plant them as to just be a host plant because they want that specific butterfly in their garden or whatever. And it really is amazing how many pollinators do visit those plants.
Yeah.
So how many they benefit from it. We had questions come in from our guests tonight. Question from Lynn. What suggestions do you have for attracting beneficial insects to help deal with flea beetles? And Caitlin, I think you were going to take the lead on this.
Yeah, I can give a couple of recommendations. But anyone else who has advice, Sylvia and Heather, please jump in too. But the whole idea of planting native plants to encourage beneficial pollinators, like Becky said, there's a lot of activity there, and it brings everybody, to use Tony's words, to the party. So you're going to have predators, you're going to have pollinators. It's just a good way to balance the ecosystem and provide habitat for everybody. And that includes predatory insects that eat things like flea beetles. And so, you know, just like Becky said, she doesn't have to hand pollinate any squash or anything like that because she has enough insects to do it for her. A lot of pest control practices that we hear about, you might not ever have to deal with if you have a good population of predatory insects. So the plants that Heather presented would be a great place to start. Basically any native plants. And if you're worried about, a lot of these, like Sylvia said, are quite vigorous. And so if you're worried about having limited space or not wanting to have to weed things out, you can always put them in pots. You can try perennials in pots, but have those around your garden. You can scatter them through like Tony suggested. And that's going to help create a really balanced ecosystem with a lot of different insects that kind of, you know, control and moderate each other.
Fantastic. All right. And the second question that came in tonight was from Brian. And do you see a major role for goldenrod as supporting pollinators? And Heather, I think you were going to be our point person on that.
Right. So I did some research on this, and then based on what I've seen in my own garden with the goldenrod, it's a great source for pollinators in the late summer and early fall because it keeps blooming. And so you'll see it attracts everything. You'll see flies, you'll see bees, beetles, wasps, butterflies, everything seems to like the goldenrod. And it gives a source for those bees that are going to be hibernating over winter to really kind of like beef up on their pollen so they can get through the winter. So I think it has a very strong role, especially in the late summer and early autumn when some of the other flowers are not so vigorous.
Okay, thanks. No, I didn't have any more. Well, I guess, is there anything that grows in the spring that's equivalent to goldenrod in the fall and late summer?
One of the ones that I really like, if you have some space, if you have even a shaded, it'll actually grow almost anywhere. And it is a vigorous spreader. It's a good ground cover. Is, and I'm probably going to butcher the Latin pronunciation, but it's Pacra aurea or golden ragwort. It's a member of the aster family, and asters are another, you know, MVP of pollinators that you often see in the fall, but it has kind of those fringy flowers. And for some reason, pollinators adore those. It's bright and cheery. It comes up in the spring, and then, you know, the flowers bloom, and then it goes to seed, and then it dies back, and it's really inconspicuous and just kind of hangs out there until the next spring. So that's one that is always really busy in my yard.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, and the spring ephemerals like the bluebells and things like that. I mean, even, isn't there's a native Solomon seal, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
So there's some nice early spring native plants that you could also incorporate into your landscape. Tony's saying he learned early on that the butterfly bush itself is not beneficial to butterflies. I forget why. Does anyone recollect why?
I'm geeking out right now at this entire subject, so thank you all for indulging me. But butterfly bushes have nectar, and so pollinators need pollen, of course, as the protein, and the nectar is their energy source. But butterfly bushes are bad, or could be harmful for two. I personally think they're bad. They're harmful for two reasons. One is that they're just kind of like snack food. They don't provide, they're not a host plant. They're not native to our particular region. And so, you know, we've heard this term host plant. They're not places where any of these pollinators lay their eggs. So they're just ornamental, which is great. You know, we want our gardens to be really pretty, but they're not providing the benefit that their name would suggest. And then the other problem with butterfly bushes is that they're invasive in our region. And so we talk about, you know, bee balm and even the ragwort that I suggested, they're going to spread, but they're not going to outcompete other plants that they're co-evolved to live with. Butterfly bush is one of the ones that will, kind of like English ivy. I have bamboo in my yard that I'm slowly eradicating. That's super invasive. So there are things that are kind of, they're bullies and they'll take over, and those are invasive plants. And then, you know, other things that are just enthusiastic, we want to encourage those. So those are some of the reasons that butterfly bush, and it's sold, it makes me crazy. Our local garden centers will be like, help the pollinators, buy a butterfly bush. And I'm like, no, don't do that. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
There is a native Virginia butterfly plant, which very different from the butterfly bush. It's not big and bushy, but it's got some really pretty small orange flowers, and that is a native, and it's something that I really like. We went to a native plant sale way before I started master gardening, and just talked to the people about like what were good things to plant just around the house, and how can we help the pollinators. And this butterfly plant has been really beneficial in our yard.
And I've actually had monarchs lay eggs on my butterfly weed.
Yeah.
So it is actually a host plant as well.
Yeah.
Little added bonus. All right, and we've got some great resources popping up for us.
Yeah, I just put it on the chat box. This is a list from Maryland Extension, and it gives you a good list of native plants to plant instead of the butterfly bush.
Oh, fantastic. So before we wrap up, we have been talking about garden journaling throughout this garden season. Garden journaling can help you track what works, what doesn't, what bugs you may see in your garden, growing patterns, weather patterns, or any diseases or insect damage your plants may experience. We are encouraging all participants in these clinics to try out a garden journal, and an easy-to-use template will be posted in the chat. At the end of the season, we'll review our garden journals together as we put this year's garden to bed and plan for 2023. Some important things to note this week in your garden journal could be the continued rain. We got 2 inches at the end of last week where I live. And if this wet season seems to be affecting your garden. Any warm weather plants like tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, beans, or corn that you actually got into the ground in the last few weeks. Note the date that you planted them so you can see how they did. How your spring crops are growing. Are you harvesting your radishes and peas yet? Is your spinach, arugula, and lettuce bolting? Or are you still able to harvest them? And then, did you do any work on the structure or layout of the garden? Many of us are still rethinking our garden plan at this point in the season, and so it's important to note what you have changed from previous years. We're nearing the point in the season where we're going to start talking about what we are harvesting and how things are growing for a while. This is the time to make sure you have noted where your plants are planted, how they are growing, the weather, the pests, and any signs of disease. If you have interplanted any flowers with your vegetables, it's also good to make a record of that so you can see if they have any impact from year to year. To register for future sessions and to find additional resources, including great articles, weed profiles, and more resources, visit fairfaxgardening.org. You can check out our calendar to see the monthly calendar for future topics. We've been hosting these plant clinics since the summer of 2020, and all were recorded and are on the VCE-Fairfax County YouTube site. In addition to the virtual plant clinic presentations, you can see the 6 presentations from our Fall 2020 Lunch and Lawn series, reviewing fall turf care and winterizing your lawn, as well as our 2021 Spring Lunch and Lawn series and our Zone 7 Garden series. There are lots of great speakers and informative topics. Thank you everyone for attending.